Welcome to Brussels Forum 2020. We are pleased to introduce the Vice President for Foreign Policy at the German Marshall Fund, Dr. Ian Lesser.
Good morning and good afternoon from Brussels. Welcome back to Brussels Forum 2020, now in its third week of a virtual edition. And this week we are focusing on the diverse challenges, the critical challenges facing societies on both sides of the Atlantic and globally. Let me at the outset thank our partners, as always, our founding partners, Daimler and the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, our forum partner, Deloitte, and all our associate and supporting and knowledge partners. We're really very grateful to all of them. Today, we're going to focus our conversation on climate change, but climate change in the context of other policy challenges facing us, including, of course, the COVID-19 crisis we're all facing. We have a fantastic group of very distinguished individuals to join the conversation today, and I'll let our moderator introduce them in a moment. Let me also just mention on this same theme, some of you will be familiar with a project GMF has had for many years, although not for the last few, Transatlantic Trends, our public opinion survey on both sides of the Atlantic. And I'm very pleased to say that we've actually have a revived edition of Transatlantic Trends. It's going to be released, the findings will be released on June 30th. We will have a launch event around that. And just to let you know, there is a very significant set of findings around climate change. So please do look out for the invitation and please do tune in for that if you can. Let me also say and thank our partners in Transatlantic Trends this year, the Institut Montaigne and the Bertelsmann Foundation. Please do look out for it. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, with very special welcome to our moderator, because Nick Gowing, who is the presenter of Thinking the Unthinkable these days, is a longtime friend of GMF and a longtime friend of Brussels Forum. So we're really extremely pleased to have him with us today to moderate this conversation. And Nick, let me turn it over to you. Thanks again.
Ian, thank you very much indeed. Much appreciated. And for me, this is also a personal tribute to Ron Asmus, who 15, 16, 17 years ago was trying to make the Brussels Forum into what it's become with the renown around the world. So I'm delighted to be remembering Ron and the work that he put in, as well as so many others in the German Marshall Fund. So today, what we're going to do for the next 58 minutes is look at, have a temperature check on climate change, the climate emergency, and the coronavirus, particularly what kind of lessons are being learned from the dramatic learnings that have had to take place because of COVID-19, the way it's upset leadership, the way leadership has had to adapt, what one of our guests has called a dramatic dislocation of so much, stability unraveling in so many ways, which were never expected. And that's the work I'm doing now in Thinking the Unthinkable. How much of what we're going through now was really being thought about, even though there were the warnings. So what I'd like to do is introduce each of the four guests and panelists and ask them at the beginning, if I may, what your view is, how much the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic, the eruption that it's created in societies everywhere around the world has had on the prospects for tackling the climate emergency and certainly all the ambitions of the Sustainable Development Goals as well. Let me first go to Rachel Kite, who is joining us from Mitford. And Rachel is the Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University, but with a long career in the World Bank, in the United Nations, and most recently running an operation which was designed to mobilize people on climate action. Rachel, a quick minute from you as to what you think the relationship is, or the catalytic effect has been of COVID on action for the climate emergency.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, and thank you to the German Marshall Fund for the invitation to be here. I think they're compound crises. I think that what we're watching very closely now is the specific shocks to different parts of the system. So the extraordinary decline in energy demand as the world sort of ground to a halt in April, and then looking at how that energy demand can come back. hopefully more cleanly, hopefully not putting public money into companies that will not be a big part of the future going forward. So will this crisis of COVID and the economic crisis it has brought about be a moment of pivot to even move more quickly through an energy transition? But I think there are also very interesting things going on in public sentiment. I think the public awareness of what resilience really means is something that can be explored by policymakers. And then there's very clear evidence that in some societies where being an expert or being a scientist was not something necessarily to be proud of, and that public policy and science were having a hard time getting along together, that the public sentiment is beginning to shift. And certainly in the UK, the evidence is very clearly that public sentiment means that they wish to know what experts think, and they wish that we would listen to science. So I think that there are real opportunities for the climate battles that coming from this very profound and very sad pandemic story that we're living through at the moment.
Thanks, Rachel. More in a moment. Let's go to Ted Halstead, who's the chairman and chief executive of the Climate Leadership Council. You're joining us from Washington, DC, Ted. And I should just underscore that you've put in Foreign Affairs the strategic case for US climate leadership recently with James Baker and George Shultz. What's your view, in a minute, of what the relationship has been between COVID-19, the pandemic, the horrors of it, and what the opportunities are now?
Thank you, Nick. Thank you to the German Marshall Fund for hosting this. I will speak from a US perspective. I think that COVID has fundamentally redefined climate policy by imposing several new tests. Every climate policy from henceforth will be viewed from the lens of the degree to which it can speed and strengthen our economic recovery. I think there are three fundamental new tests. One, I think in the United States, climate policy needs to pay for itself. With ballooning federal deficits and decimated state budgets, the idea of policies like a Green New Deal that by some advocates would cost $16 trillion in new revenue are just dead on arrival. And going forward, any climate policy needs to pay for itself, the best candidate being a revenue neutral carbon tax, which of course is what businesses and economists are pushing for. A second major test of climate policy is that it must help those who have been most vulnerable and whose economic prospects have been most devastated by the pandemic. There's been a very interesting test case in the United States. The first big stimulus package came together with bipartisan support for direct stimulus payments to the American people. That proved to be administratively feasible. It proved to be bipartisan. 70 to 80% of Americans want more of them. And very interestingly, President Trump put his name on those checks. The point is there's an appetite for continued stimulus checks to the American people, but they can't be deficit financed. And if the revenue from a carbon tax is recycled directly to the American people in dividends, that provides a winning formula to help those most vulnerable and to solve the climate crisis. And finally, climate policy needs to promote growth and competitiveness. And there's a really interesting argument of how the United States has a carbon efficiency advantage over so many of its competitors, which right now the rules of trade are actually subsidizing dirty manufacturing overseas. But through a border carbon adjustment, or essentially carbon tariffs, we could actually gain a significant competitive advantage and promote American innovation. Let me leave it there.
And Ted, my question quickly, I mean, are you seeing a catalyzing effect from COVID-19 and what we've all been through? Are you seeing quickly a catalyzing effect on addressing the climate emergency?
I believe that's an overstatement. We have compounding crisis, a health crisis on top of an economic crisis, on top of a racial justice crisis, which has clearly pushed climate to the back burner, but it will soon reemerge as a top tier issue. I think it's an overstatement to think that there's been an immediate boost, but over the long term, it will be a dominant issue and it will come back, but redefined based on the tests that I just mentioned.
All right, thanks very much, Ted. Let me just pause at this moment and say, we'd love to hear from you in the next 50 minutes about your thoughts. And let me just give you 3 ways of getting in touch with us. Brussels Forum, all one word, at gmfus.org, Brussels Forum at gmfus.org. Through YouTube, if you're watching us on YouTube, through the live stream there, and on Twitter, hashtag, all one word, Brussels Forum. Please get in touch because you can be entering the conversation and stimulating the debate as well. Let's now, this is a transatlantic debate between North America and right around the European Union. and I speak from part of Europe, of course, which isn't any more part of the European Union. Let's go to Linda McAvan, who's Executive Director for European Relations at the European Climate Foundation, joining us from the north of England, from Sheffield. Linda, your answer to the question, is COVID-19 acting as a real catalyst, certainly in Europe? You're watching what's happening in Brussels with the Green Deal, with what's coming out with the 750 billion of contributions, of loans, of grants coming through for recovery. Is it now embedded at a speed which you weren't expecting, certainly before the horrors of the pandemic?
Well, I think listening to Ted just now was interesting because he said that climate policy must pay for itself, where the debate in Brussels is actually about we need to invest in climate, we need to invest, and EU leaders are going to meet on Friday, and they're going to be talking about a big investment package funded through borrowing at EU level. So there's an immediate difference there. But I think for me, before I was worked at the Climate Foundation, I was a politician and a member of the European Parliament, and was back in 2008 when the crash happened. I was working on the climate legislation which led to the Copenhagen summit. And the biggest difference is really that back then, we weren't talking about climate, we weren't talking about recovery being about a green recovery. It disappeared. This time, what we're getting from Brussels, what we're getting from politicians, including Angela Merkel, European Commission, President, most government leaders, including right across Europe now, is the right words. We're getting all the right words. The test's going to be in the next few weeks, whether those words, that the green recovery is going to be central to the European Union and its 27 member states moving forward, whether they translate into real policy on the ground.
Thanks, Linda. And let's go finally to Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Welcome, Senator. You have lobbied long and hard. You work hard on these very critical issues. What's your assessment, building on what Ted has said from the US perspective?
I see two things that have moved as a result of COVID. One is that there's always been a fringe in the United States that was anti-science and anti-government. We've always had anti-vaxxers, we've always had flat earth people and so forth. Some time ago, the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry took a look at that fringe ideology and thought, we could make that work for us. And so they've pumped it up to the point where it's now a really dominant ideology within the Republican Party. And I think that anti-science, anti-government ideology has taken a terrible blow through the COVID crisis. And that has ramifications for climate when we finally get serious on that in America. The second thing that I've seen is that we've had in Congress to respond to COVID in unimaginable ways, compared to pre-COVID. And what COVID has done is it has widened very considerably the aperture of the possible in Congress. Who thought we'd be doing multi-trillion-dollar bills? Who thought we'd be doing these enormous legislative efforts? Who thought the Fed would be unleashed in a way like this? So I think those two things, while indirectly bearing on climate, are significant. One, the aperture of what Congress has seen itself as capable of doing is significantly widened. And two, the fossil fuel propped up ideology of anti-science, anti-government has been deprecated and damaged.
All right, let me ask you, thank you, Senator. Let me ask all of you to respond in more detail to the relationship now between the public and also the political class and the corporates, about the public pressure. And Rachel, you mentioned it right at the beginning. How is this going to manifest itself? And obviously there are great differences between the 27 in Europe plus Britain and the United States, the 50 states in the United States, big changes. But what are you seeing, Rachel? What are you detecting, given that you're now in a school of government? What are you detecting about the change in public mood and how important that's going to be?
Well, I think that the story of this recovery is, and the story actually of the struggle to get ourselves to a point where we're resilient to climate impacts, is around the relationship of local communities to the global dynamics, and is a relationship between sort of individual resilience and community and national resilience. And I think you can boil that down very much, if we look certainly at the numbers across the United States, but around the world, to livelihoods, jobs, and well-being. And I think that there is an opportunity for leadership to not be trapped by the way things used to be, and to see that there is a vein of opportunity here. So we know that, for example, I think in Massachusetts, we've lost something like 20,000 jobs in the renewable energy industry in the last 2 months. In this country, people are always afraid that we may lose the last remaining jobs in the coal sector. And of course, there is a need to have a just transition for all of those people who've been employed in shale and the fossil fuel sector up until now. But there are many, many, many more new, good quality jobs in the deep refurbishment of the built environment, in renewable energy, in exploiting offshore wind for the Atlantic seaboard of the United States. All of this is actually very exciting. It means investing in the education system so that the blue collar jobs, that the talent pool is there for the blue collar jobs and the white collar jobs in those industries. It means fiddling with tax regimes so that you allow for community composting and biogas. And but these things are doable. I mean, we've got people running for president who've had plans for everything. This can be done, and it doesn't have to be a story of sacrifice. It doesn't have to be a story of fear that we have to run away from something. We can actually run to a new future. And I think you see that in the Green New Deal. You've seen that in the rhetoric from New Zealand. You've seen that in the rhetoric from the Korean government, although they are continuing to put public money into what I think will be a couple of very zombie-like coal-dominated conglomerates. But you see the same conversation in India as they have to try to pivot even further away from coal. And you see the same struggle around equity, justice, and fossil fuels in South Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a moment here, is what I'm saying.
Could I just pick up what Ted has said? And I'll come to you in a moment, Ted. Ted essentially saying that this has all gone on the back burner compared to what's happening with the pandemic and employment and economic prospects, particularly in an election year. Whether you look at it from the British point of view, the UN point of view, the World Bank point of view, or the Tufts point of view, what's your view?
Well, I think in the immediate relief, the language of climate was on the back burner, but we're coming out of immediate relief into the first stage of emergence and then recovery. And I don't think it's in the back burner, because with the amount of public money that's going to be needed to restart economies, with the amount of public money that's going to be needed to prop up and support the public balance sheets of developing countries, where we've got more than 95 countries going to the IMF for help, we're going to have to use that public money judiciously, and that public money is going to have to go into things which are going to be resilient and put us in a better place for the future. And that's going to have to be clean energy, tree planting, resilient land use, industry which is energy efficient. I mean, we cannot afford to spend the kinds of numbers that the senator talked about and not have that work to the maximum for the future. And if there are jobs in that, and there are clean areas in that, and if there is resilient local food systems in that, people will be content with that.
Ted, I mean, I come to you having read your piece in Foreign Affairs, but particularly about jobs and economic prosperity, and the fact that there's jobs and there's prosperity in greening. But you were rather negative a moment ago. Help us understand the paradox here, that there's economic prosperity ahead from greening, but actually the public don't yet get it largely in the US.
Well, so just to be clear, I'm actually very optimistic about our climate future. I was just pointing out that in the very short term, climate has been put to the back burner, but there's no question it'll be a front burner issue going forward. To agree with Rachel, I mean, there is a short-term opportunity for climate funding and stimulus bills, but I'm more interested in the medium to long term, where we will be dealing with massive deficits over the long term. Let me respond to several things that my friend Sheldon Whitehouse said. First of all, I just want to congratulate him. He has introduced several bipartisan climate bills recently. And that speaks to a trend. Climate is one of the very rare issues in American politics where the public wants a bipartisan solution. Ultimately, as I'm sure Senator Whitehouse would agree, we need much more ambitious climate policy. So let me respond to two specific things. One, I see far more optimism on the Republican side. I think there's been a fundamental pivot over the last year where climate denialism on the Republican side is over. They understand that they ignore the climate issue at their own peril, especially because there's a fundamental risk of hemorrhaging younger voters on this issue. In fact, a recent survey we put out, it got a lot of attention last year, shows that 70% of Republican voters are concerned about alienating young voters on this specific issue. I think the Republican position now is that climate change is real, the Green New Deal is bad, therefore Republicans need a new climate policy of their own, and that gets very interesting. The other thing I'd like to comment on is the role of fossil fuel industries. If we look at what's happening in the present, they clearly want to be part of the solution. One of the most innovative things that my organization has done is it's built the broadest climate coalition in US history, including many of the oil majors, environmental majors, Nobel economists, the 4 most recent Fed chairs across the board. And that group is unified around a $43 carbon tax, raising 5% real per year, which would make it the most ambitious carbon price of any leading emitting country. And that is backed in name and in money and in political muscle by the fossil fuel industry. That signifies a new potential consensus that leads to what we all know we need in the United States, which is a bipartisan climate breakthrough. And on that case, thinking to the next Congress, I'm actually very optimistic.
Just picking up on your point about fundamental optimism, particularly what you see in the Republican Party, particularly the younger Republicans, is this political opportunism, or are they now convinced by the arguments?
No, I think it's very real. I mean, young Republicans are almost indistinguishable from young Democrats in their climate concern. We recently had 30 Republican College Federation state chairs come out in support of our plan. We have all 8 of the former Republican Council of Economic Advisors chairs. That is the top economic advisors to all past living Republican presidents, all coming together behind a common solution. I think Republican leaders are genuine. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, says we need Republican climate solutions. The House Minority Leader McCarthy is saying we ignore this issue at our own peril. I think the big question for Republicans is what will Republican climate policy look like? And very briefly, there are only 3 alternatives. You can regulate, which is clearly not the Republican solution. You can subsidize, which is also not the Republican solution because it has the government picking winners and losers and requires higher taxes and deficits. On almost all issues, the Republican solution is market-based, and the ultimate landing place for Republicans will be a price on carbon, a solution that is based on free market economics and limited government. Because in fact, you can trade a very ambitious price on carbon for regulations that are no longer needed, providing the plan we put forth would reduce US carbon emissions by 50% by 2035, far outdoing the US Paris commitment, but in a way that will actually shrink the size of government. That's where I think you can find bipartisan consensus, especially in the next Congress.
Senator Whitehouse, let me pick up on you, and Linda, I'll come to you in a moment from the European perspective. Do you agree with what Ted has been saying about the shift, particularly in the Republicans on the other side of the chamber? You're on mute, unfortunately. One moment.
Congress is going to be the trailing edge of that shift. I agree that there is a shift in the Republican Party. I agree that there is activity among young Republicans. I agree that for the corporations that sponsored climate denial for decades, that's no longer a effective public strategy for them. But I would add 2 things. One, I think that some big industries, particularly agriculture and finance and investment, are beginning to see that the fossil fuels climate denial schemes actually have really bad consequences for them. This isn't just a question of investor relations and customer relations. There's actually a danger that a carbon bubble crash or continued degradation of the growing environment damages their fundamental business models, that they experience a catastrophe in their business because of a failure to address climate change. So that has changed the motivation of some of the other big industries. But I will tell you that in Congress, there is still essentially zero corporate presence in favor of any climate legislation. We are the last place that you will see it. The big fossil fuel companies will engage publicly, they'll speak in forums, they'll join groups, they'll say things through their public relations schemes, and they'll do a lot of stuff out there. The last thing that they're going to do is to go into Leader Mitch McConnell's office and say, Mitch, we really have to do something on this now. We are, in serious trouble, and we're actually going to reverse our polarities here. And instead of funding the Republican Party to stop climate action, we're actually going to demand that you allow climate action. That for sure has not happened. We see some signs that agriculture and finance are suiting up on the side of the field, getting ready to come out on the field. They are not on the field, and no one should pretend that they are. The lobbying and electioneering apparatus of corporate America is still anti-climate action, although less virulently so, and the trajectory is towards a moment when that shift will come, but that shift has not yet come.
Let me pin this down with both of you, and then I'll go to Europe and also to Rachel as well. But again, we're talking about climate change and the impact of coronavirus. You're saying, Senator, and I'll come to you in a moment on this, Ted, as well, you're saying that really coronavirus has not moved things in any way, certainly from the political perspective you're talking from.
No, it has not. And the problem with a lot of the manner in which the fossil fuel industry has prevented action in Congress, they have set up a lot of front groups, sort of zombie groups that they fund and funded for many, many years, who are out very actively campaigning against climate activity and mocking climate science. And although they, as corporate entities, may have stepped back a little bit from espousing climate denial and climate obstruction, the front groups that they set up, whether directly controlled still by them or whether just continuing forward as zombie entities, are still very aggressively anti-action. Right. So all of this is operating in a world completely separate from coronavirus that was set up to continue kind of despite any outside pressure, and it has not yet been shut down, or better yet, one day actually put into reverse.
All right, well, Ted, there was a very firm no there. Would you be no as well with qualifications?
Well, I think what is happening is underlying tectonic shifts leading to the inevitability of bipartisan climate legislation. Tectonic shift number one is strong corporate leadership and demand for climate action, investor leadership, strong public sentiment in favor of climate action, especially bipartisan climate action. It's clearly a top-tier issue among Democrats. It is becoming a top-tier issue among Republicans. As to, affected industries, I mean, I'm going to put out the positive counter to what Senator Whitehouse is saying. We have seen recently several oil majors leaving trade associations that are decidedly anti-climate. We've seen trade associations come out in support of the Paris Agreement. In my own organization, we have seen a number of the energy majors, from major fossil fuel companies to the largest solar manufacturer in the United States, put real money behind a very meaningful carbon price. And look, why are they doing this? There are a number of reasons, but ultimately they would much prefer a cost-effective market-based solution over a regulatory paradigm and endless battles over sort of legal battles over regulating industry. So they prefer a market-based solution, and they're putting their resources behind it. Sheldon may be right that they're not doing enough, but there has been a sea change among the oil majors in terms of their advocacy, and all of them are now publicly on board with a very significant carbon price. And I think that that is a real game changer.
Great. Linda, please be on standby. I'm trying to cover America at the moment, so it's kind of difficult to bridge the Atlantic on this. Rachel, let me just come to you for a reality check as well. Do you agree with the firm no of the senator, or can you see movement which is actually quite significant, which is being created by coronavirus?
No, I think the analogy is that there are storm clouds gathering, as it were, but the rain hasn't started falling on Senator Whitehouse yet. And so, and to go back to what Ted was just saying, I think the tippy point of the oil and gas industry is pivoting very hard to try to work out what their business model is going to be that will make them successful over the next 20 years. You saw that really quite a significant announcement from BP this week, but I'm talking about the tippy top. I'm talking about Equinor, BP, Shell, Total, to some extent Repsol, whatever. That then you've got, you know, the other listed majors, Exxon, Occidental, Chevron. They are not in the same bracket, and then you've got 80% of fossil fuels around the world, which are mainly in national oil companies in countries who are about to go through extraordinary economic stress as a result of the pandemic. And they are going to be supported by the IMF providing budgetary support to these countries. These are large nationally owned companies. They have extraordinary payrolls. They are a big part of society. And that money, which nobody wants to be using for something that is going to slow down the possibility of sort of an energy transition, is going to be used to prop up companies that will need to go through their own transition. So I think that while we can let listed companies lead the way, and because they're listening to investors and they're seeing where the returns are and they understand the writing on the wall, we are as an international community going to have to help the countries like the Indonesias, the Angolas, the Irans, the Iraqs, the Malaysias, the Indias, the of this world make their own transition, because they're carbon intensive, and they have a lot wrapped up in publicly state-owned utilities and oil companies. So everybody can be right. In the US, the worst thing to be doing would be using public money to prop up companies that just will not be there at the end of the decade because of energy demand and because of the investor interest in clean air, and that would be a terrible shame for the people of Oklahoma, Texas, where the shale and oil industry is focused.
And only this week we've seen BP slash its assets value by
$17.5 billion,
billion dollars, and also belief that there's going to be a stable but low price market for energy, and probably many of their investments will not be taken up. Their exploration investments will not be taken up. Rachel, thank you for the moment. Let's go to Europe, because Linda, I've got one question here. Given the large amount of money the EU is putting into the Green Deal, have there been discussions to ensure that some of the most vulnerable parts of the population can really take advantage of those funds? Can you offer any insight on that?
Well, there are proposals on the table in Brussels and proposals on the table in different countries. And one thing we have learned in Europe is that if you want climate policy to have public support, you've got to take into account the impact of policies on a large section of society. We learned that from the Gilets jaunes movement in France. And politicians are very much more aware now of the social impacts. But just to pick up on something,
which was over the putting up
the price. Gilets jaunes was the yellow vest movement,
which was about putting up the price of diesel oil.
Yeah, and it was a real threat to Macron, the President Macron and his government. And there's a lot more emphasis now on making sure that when we take climate action, it must be socially just. We have to link it into the wider issues of social justice. But what's interesting for me, listening to the senator, listening to the US conversation, is how about the bipartisan approach, is that's what's been also the sea change in Europe, because the Green Deal in Europe isn't the Green New Deal US style. It's a different concept. The Green Deal in Europe came out of the European elections and the public mood pushing politicians in Europe,
which was last year.
Climate action that was last year, May last year. We didn't expect that to happen. People said the European elections would all be about the far right increasing, etc. But instead, a lot of young people came out to vote. And it was interesting listening to Ted about the young Republicans, and I think you said, Ted, that there's not much difference between them and the Young Democrats now on climate change. And I think that's really important because, you know, we are going to borrow a lot of money, as all the speakers have said. And what we can't afford to do is to let that younger generation have the double whammy of having to pay off the debt that we incur now, and at the same time have to face with the climate consequences of inaction at the present time. And, you know, Rachel's right about, you know, stranded assets and the problems of investing in the wrong things for now. So the key thing in the next few weeks as Europe takes the decisions on its stimulus packages is one in Brussels to get it right, but to make sure that, you know, the long term, that we don't spend all the money now on the wrong things, and have nothing left to invest in the climate in the future.
One of the things yes.
I believe there may be a consensus among all panelists here, which is that in order to solve the climate problem required in scale and speed, we need a very meaningful carbon price. I suspect we all agree on that point. Picking up on Linda's point about the Gilets jaunes, yes, if the public perceives a carbon price as an increase in their energy costs, it is very unlikely to fly politically, which is why giving the money back in dividends, we believe, is the winning political formula. But let me go to the international sphere for a moment and a real sign of optimism. I believe that there's a possibility for a real convergence between the EU, the US, the UK, even Canada, around the idea of a border carbon adjustment. Anytime you put in place a carbon price, you face fundamental competitiveness problems, and there are two ways to deal with it. You can either exempt energy intensive and trade exposed industries, which has been the model for the most part under the ETS, or you can have an across the board carbon price with a border carbon adjustment, which economists and businesses would say is the preferred idea. But I think there's a real positive opportunity here where the US and the EU join forces on a significant carbon tariff or border carbon adjustment, promoting their own competitiveness, but also creating a whole new approach to climate diplomacy that gives other leading emitters a very stark choice. Basically, you know, follow suit and raise your climate ambition or face economic penalties. And I think that if you look at 25 years of climate diplomacy based on international negotiations premised on voluntary reductions, that model has not worked that well. There's a whole new model out there, which is climate diplomacy based on economic incentives. And the work of the BCA in pushing forward the work of the EU in pushing forward a BCA, the UK's talked about it too, is a really promising area for EU-US collaboration going forward.
Thanks, Ted.
If I can jump in with Ted on that, one of the greatest features of a robust price on carbon is its exportability, is its role as a foundation of climate diplomacy. If you try to match regulatory regimes between two countries and figure out how you can make a trade adjustment for that, it's a massively complicated endeavor, and one that's very hard to prove out at the end of the day. It's very easy, if you've got a proper price on carbon, to see that it balances between two countries and to make the respective adjustments. So I think one of the real causes for optimism here is that once we get the political will to apply a meaningful price on carbon and offset the multi-trillion-dollar subsidy the IMF calculates the fossil fuel industry enjoys and is defending, then it can propagate very, very quickly and very, very honestly. And the trade problems, the trade cheating and the improper trade competition can be beaten back quite quickly.
I'm getting a lot of questions coming in, but I want to pick up on what Ted and the Senator have just said. Go back to Linda, and I've got the European Green Deal in front of me, Linda. The environmental ambition of the Green Deal will not be achieved by Europe acting alone. When you listen to the debate in the United States and what we've just heard from those who are in the United States, do you think this is going to be difficult for Europe to try and achieve that, hoping that this is beyond Europe and those like the United States will step into line eventually?
Well, actually, I've been a little bit heartened when I've heard what I've heard this morning in the US from Ted and from the senator, because if it's true that we're seeing a switch, to support climate action, and we have elections later this year, and in Europe for the centre right, climate has become a big issue, and they're having to change their policies. The European Commission president is, after all, she's not a socialist or green politician. She's a German centre-right former defense secretary. She comes from a party who traditionally, I was a legislator, I was on the receiving end of the lobbying by German industry, very against climate action. But last week we saw that same commission president put the big package on the table, and we've seen Angela Merkel put on the table in Germany a stimulus package which does not offer subsidies to the fossil fuel, to the car, the diesel and petrol engine car. It says, yes, we're going to help the car industry, but only if they invest in electric vehicles. So we've seen a switch in Europe, and it's interesting to hear that potentially we are seeing, a switch in the US, and not the kind of blanket opposition to the Paris Agreement, to any form of international cooperation that we heard about a lot in the rhetoric in the last 4 years.
Thanks, Linda. I've got a lot of questions coming in here. We've got 20 minutes left, or just under 20 minutes. One quick question though, Linda. It's now a year since the European elections, when there was this backlash by the public on the climate emergency and so on. Has that anxiety been continuing for the last year, or is there any sign of it softening? In other words, is public opinion softening because of the pandemic? We want jobs, we need jobs. Let's forget about carbon for the moment.
I think it's certainly true that jobs are going to be at the top of people's concerns coming out of this crisis. I mean, we haven't even begun to feel the impact of the COVID, really. We're still in this sort of limbo period where the lockdowns are just easing across Europe, and governments are beginning to roll out the stimulus packages, and they won't be able to subsidize businesses forever as we come into the autumn. So I think jobs are going to be important. But I think one thing the pandemic is showing people is that, the sort of people who are climate deniers are the kind of people who never thought a pandemic could happen, who, when it all started, were a bit sort of, oh, the nanny state, governments overreacting, closing down. And I think maybe in the back of people's minds now are that bad things can happen, really bad things. And when they do happen, they look to their governments to do something about them. And I think
they realise it's even worse potentially with the climate emergency.
Yeah, exactly. And I think people know that we have to future-proof. We have to future-proof our lifestyles against pandemics, which nobody ever imagined this. Nobody. And I used to work on public health, and we went through all these pandemic preparedness plans, when we did all this work. But I think deep down, we never really imagined this. And I think the climate emergency is something else that we're just beginning to understand is very real, and these things can happen. They're not just things that are sort of pushed about by certain people to make us afraid.
Linda, thank you. I've got several questions for each of you individually. Rachel, given your past work with the UN and the World Bank, especially around the Paris Agreement, will multilateral organizations continue to play a role in the climate debate, or will countries pursue a more nationalistic approach, given generally growing nationalistic policy approaches?
Great question. I think that, well, first of all, I think that whoever wins in November in the US, the fact that we're basically in a new era of trade war with China, and given the EU's relationship with China, actually, I think that the trade discussions become very important, and how we embed climate in that is actually going to be a very big driver of whether we're successful or not. Multilateral, I think it becomes much more bilateral or mini-lateral rather than multilateral. I think there's no escaping the fact that the current multilateral system is not fit for purpose for this kind of existential crisis world. We have to put scaffolding around the systems we've got at the moment, so that they don't sort of fall out and they sort of implode, or that they are held together so that they do what they need to do. And then we've got to we've really got to start imagining what kinds of processes, what kinds of institutions we really need to sort of come as a phase 2, or even stand up new ones. There are key areas where we need this. And so I think that the UNFCCC is still the mothership. That's the UN Convention and its agreements. But I think that minilateral and sort of working coalitions, which has been a growing trend over the last 10 to 15 years, that is going to be where we're going to see the greatest progress. I think there is no doubt that there are nationalist and tendencies to look in a number of very key countries. The economic crisis that they are facing is going to cause real problems for their ability to operate at the multilateral level. And we have a scarcity of multilateral caliber leadership at the moment in a number of key places. So it's a global problem, but I think that we're going to see a number of regional and smaller efforts that will make big progress.
Do you think that bodes badly for COP26 in Glasgow in November next year?
No, I think that I think there's an extraordinary opportunity for the UK government with Italy to to be the best that the UK can be with a globalist vision. I think they're making it very complicated for themselves at the moment. I mean, I have to say, I am one of the friends of COP26, and so I speak from friendship. But reorganizing your foreign office at this moment is going to be a distraction. We have other distractions as well, and I think the managing through the Brexit implications mean that there's extraordinary stress on a global diplomatic corps that has to bring everybody to Glasgow ready to have a deal for greater ambition. Obviously, it doesn't all happen in Glasgow, it's all the way up to them, but there the UN has really got to sort of really start imagining, how do you do global negotiations? How do you practice the art of diplomacy when you can't be in a huddle? And I think there's some very real fears from developing countries who feel that the table has not been laid to their benefit in the way that negotiations happen already. And they're worried that, I think, as you go to more remote forms of negotiation, that they're going to lose out. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but there's some room for real creativity in order to keep the pace of negotiation moving forward, despite the dislocation from the virus.
Yeah, I should say that the Foreign Office and the Department for International Development are going to be merged at this critical moment here in London. Ted, you've mentioned a few, this is a question, I'm sorry, I don't have any names of anyone who's submitted these questions. You've mentioned a few big name Republicans in Congress who you say have voiced their concerns about climate change. If President Trump is re-elected, what do you think the Republican response to climate change will look like, given the president's dismissal of climate change?
So, number one, we have a carbon dividends plan. If President Trump is reelected, we're glad to rename it the Trump dividend plan. And President Trump has shown that he is quite interested in direct payments and putting his name on it. Look, if you take at face value, or the most sort of logical interpretation of why President Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement, it is number one, out of a concern that US climate ambition would undermine the competitiveness of American firms, undermine US living standards, and third of all, why should the US act if China and India are not doing their part? Well, it turns out that that logic can be turned around. We're coming out with a report in the next couple of months, which we think will be very influential among Republicans. We've been previewing it with some offices, called the US Carbon Advantage. It shows that we have a very significant carbon efficiency advantage over many emerging countries. I mean, take China, for example. Our manufacture of steels, cars, chemicals are so much more carbon efficient than theirs. But China, in many of these arenas, is the global leader. If we put in place a border carbon adjustment, it would enable us to leverage that carbon advantage to the benefit of US manufacturers, to the benefit of US jobs. And a border adjustment would also compel other countries either to follow or penalize them economically. So it answers the core Republican concerns. And if you imagine a carbon pricing plan with a border carbon adjustment that also includes some form of coal transition, which is a constituency that's very important to President Trump, you have the makings of a bipartisan deal, especially in a divided Congress where President Trump would be looking for a bipartisan win. So it is within the range of the feasible.
The feasible. Senator, adding to that challenge there for those of you up on the Hill, here's another question which is building on that. Ted mentioned some of your bipartisan work on climate change. which climate policies or initiative do you see as the most likely to be implemented and implementable in the short term?
Well, the short term is going to be tough because President Trump is a very baleful influence on all things climate at this point. And while Republicans remote from Congress may be coming around, and while a few in Congress may be starting to come around, when they run up against the wall of Trump's disapproval, that's a pretty thorough stopper. So one thing that could be very helpful from the UK is if Boris Johnson, as a fellow flamboyant conservative who takes climate change somewhat seriously, could help get into the head of Donald Trump on this. People should recognize that in 2009, Donald Trump signed a full-page ad in the New York Times saying that the science of climate change was incontrovertible and that the consequences of failing to act on climate would be catastrophic and irreversible. So, you know, we have a 2009 Donald Trump who, if we could get back to, we'd be in a much, much better position. I think perhaps the prime minister can help him get there. He is certainly a mercurial individual, and there are a few forces in the White House that are trying to get him off the Chinese hoax island and more into a reality-based environment on this. So that would be a really useful step. In the meantime, I think we just have to plan for November and see what happens then.
I'm now looking at it from London, but both you and Ted, let me put that to you based on what you've just said, Senator. Could it just be that in the next 4 months, the president sees this as a vote winner and therefore does a complete about turn based on what he wrote in 2009?
I think that there is zero chance that President Trump comes around to pro-climate policy prior to the election. However, if there is a second Trump term and there is a divided Congress, which is almost certain, and he's there then playing for his legacy, not to his base, there is a non-negligible possibility. Since we're wrapping up, though, I do want to make one final comment of optimism, which is I believe that there is a profound opportunity for bipartisan consensus around the theme of positioning the United States as the foremost energy innovator in all aspects of the energy transition. That is a shared objective that we could build on Capitol Hill.
Because you wrote in Foreign Affairs, the US risks becoming a bystander in a world order dominated by clean energy. Is that going to get resonance, do you think, that kind of concern?
We're now in 4th place behind China, Germany, and Japan in terms of the production of solar cells, batteries, wind turbines, and so forth. You know, just as the IT revolution drove so much of the dynamism and job creation of the last 20 years, it's the clean energy revolution that's going to drive so much of the dynamism of the next couple of decades. And yes, there's a big opportunity for bipartisan support there.
I saw Rachel nodding. I'll come to you in a moment, Rachel, but just Senator, that question I put to you and Ted, could it be that he looks back to 2009, the president says, that could be a vote winner?
I think if he starts to feel desperate, there's almost nothing that he won't do to try to win. I think that the prospect of him flipping on climate is offset by the extent to which the fossil fuel industry funds him and funds the Republican Party. And so it would require a similar flip of the fossil fuel industry to say, we're going to continue to give you all this money, but in this case, now we're actually going to support you getting serious about climate. That has not been the industry's position in their politics. And there are some really forceful companies like Marathon Petroleum, and there's some really wild entities like the Wildcatters in the oil patch in Oklahoma and Texas, who've made millions, even billions, and have zero interest in doing anything about climate. And their power as the Republican funding base is very much, I think, in Trump's calculus as he makes the decision whether to switch. Until the fossil fuel industry genuinely switches, it's going to be very, very hard for the Republican Party to switch, because the fossil fuel industry is the Republican Party's dominant funder. One could even describe the Republican Party as the political wing of the fossil fuel industry.
Rachel, I saw you nodding several times.
Yeah, I think the Senate, I think when you look at the United States from outside of the United States, you tend to look at the sort of guy at the top of the ticket, the charismatic leader. But the issue here really is what has happened to the Republican Party. And that's the story of money and politics. And there are good Republican governors all across this land who know where the new jobs are going to be, who know where the competitiveness is, who know that what the dynamism of the US economy could be, from Indiana to Massachusetts to Maryland to Texas, whatever. And the parties, so the numbers are there, the evidence is there, the data is there, but there's something stopping that translating into good policy which would make good conservative voters happy, and that's the story, the insidious story of money in politics and money from one particular industry. And so I think it's going to be a very interesting tussle over the next few years, because that industry is on the wane, and this is in some respects the sort of violent last fight, because we will simply not be competitive with a heavily carbonized economy. That's not where investors are going to be wanting to put their money. And eventually, the US will really struggle if we start to see mandatory transparency and reporting for companies across Europe, if you start to see the decarbonisation happening in other big economies, and all eyes obviously on the 14th five-year plan from China and exactly how China manages its coal going forward. All eyes on a shift in attitudes in Japan. All eyes on the second moon government and their attitude to exporting fossil fuels. So the world is moving in a direction at different speeds, and the US really can't afford to get left behind. I have no vote in this country, but that the Republican Party would cut off the nose to spite its own face, given that it is a conservative party that should be interested in vibrant local economies is quite astounding.
Quickly, before I go to Linda for a last word, but using that word that the senator used, the big energy companies are flipping. Do you think, though, there could be a flip at some point, given what we've heard from BP this week?
The energy, if you have
sorry, Ted, could I just ask Rachel that one?
Yeah, I think you're starting to for listed majors. Yes, you saw the votes for shareholder action at Chevron, at Oxy, and Exxon look very different this year. I think there's an unrelenting pressure on them. Again, the value of oil and gas companies is less than 5% of the S&P now. So this is going to be a declining part of the US's economic future story. And so you're going to have investor pressure. I think the boards will have to change. You saw Lee Raymond get knocked off the JP Morgan board. I think that this is really hand-to-hand combat at the moment, and I'm not sure which driver pushes it over the edge first. But this is a story of decline, not a story of growth.
All right, Rachel, thank you. We're almost out of time. Linda, thank you for being patient, but I've got to sort of focus on America and then Europe very quickly, if you can. What do you think we'll be talking about in 6 months to a year? Will we be talking about a real dynamism coming from Europe, or will there be anchor chains dragging and slowing down the momentum, which is actually there enshrined in the new Green Deal as something which is an absolute priority politically for the European Union?
Well, I very much hope it's the former that we get. We have good momentum at the moment. There is a fossil fuel industry lobbying, as the senator has said, just in Europe, just like in the US, but there is momentum. There is pressure from the streets, pressure from the people. So there's hope. We have the leaders meeting on Friday. Let's hope they realize that now is the time. Now is the time to act on climate and to take those decisions for the future.
Linda McCavan, Ted Halstead, Rachel Kite, and Sheldon Whitehouse, Senator. Thank you, all four of you, very much indeed for your time and for saying that actually there is forward movement, but there are significant challenges ahead. This is the first of two webinars about climate change and coronavirus. The second one will be tomorrow with about the same time with members of the corporate sector. So thanks to all four of you. Thanks for joining, and thanks for the questions as well from me and Nick Gowing and the whole German Marshall Fund team and the Brussels Forum. Thank you. Bye-bye.